So with that as a background, let's talk a little bit about where biochemistry fits with the other subjects. So biochemistry, the thing that's going to explain these properties of living matter is, I would argue, is a great unifier of biology with chemistry, physics, and math. And so biochemistry, if I write it here in the center, receives, you could think of this as receiving inputs or able to explain a variety of other areas of biology with which you might be familiar. So genetics gives us inputs, not observations from cell biology give us some inputs, and observations from what we now call molecular biology all give us observations that we then in turn need to be able to explain biochemically. We can also use structural biology, that is looking at the structure of macromolecules, and biophysics to get inputs into biochemistry. And what emerges, of course, when we do this, what our goal is in this course is not to simply describe some genetic interaction or to point to some structure inside a cell or to tell you with a bunch of cartoons that represent molecules what's happening. It's really to get at mechanism. It's only by understanding the chemical mechanisms that are responsible for the things that we observe in cell biology, genetics, molecular biology, and so forth, that we really can understand things. And then, of course, the beauty of this is the output that comes from understanding biochemistry, and that's understanding anatomy and physiology. Because now we can understand, for example, things like how the heart pumps and how the lungs manage to exchange oxygen and how fluid flows through your kidneys, because we understand the biochemical mechanism that underlies all of this. So if we say that biochemistry is the chemistry of the molecules of life, if this is the biochemistry of the molecules of life, it's, of course, as you know, carbon-based. So why carbon? Well, there are only 5 elements that can make greater than 3 bonds, right? Otherwise, you end up with like long chains of atoms, and that's not what we need. We need to have 3 or more chemical bonds. And as I said, there are only 5 elements that can make greater than or equal to 3 bonds. And those elements are boron, carbon, nitrogen, silicon, and phosphorus. So why don't we have, for example, other types of things? Well, metals, of course, as you know, the reason that we don't have life with metals is because they really form ions and not so much covalent bonds. They also form metallic bonds that we'll talk about later, right? And then, of course, noble gases, which are non-reactive. So that rules this out, that rules this out. We're stuck with these 5. Now, why not have a life form that's based on boron? Right? Well, boron, as you know, has 3 valence electrons. Okay. And this electron, this state of electron deficiency, right, limits, it's electron deficient, and it limits its stability. How about nitrogen? This has 5 valence electrons, okay? And this is really electron rich. But all of those electrons make for repulsive forces that limit the extent to which we can make long chains. What's a great example, right? The problem is I can make short chains. I can make things like NNN, right? But what's the problem with molecules that contain a bunch of nitrogens all stuck together? Anybody know? Yes? They become explosive, exactly. Okay? These kind of nitrogen compounds are great for rocket fuel, but they're not great for life. Okay. Carbon, as you know, 4 valence electrons. Very stable. Works really great. What about silicon? Right? We know that silicon, right? It's right below carbon in the periodic table. Right? So what's the problem with silicon? There was a great Star Trek adventure many years ago about silicon-based life forms. They were like rocks, right? Why don't we have a silicon-based life form? Well, the problem with silicon is that the radius is too large. And as a result, we get limited orbital overlap. And so as a result, although silicon can form networks, a lot of the time silicon basically ends up forming weak silicon-silicon bonds. Okay? So when you have a silicon-silicon bond, it's a weak bond. How about phosphorus, which is below nitrogen in the periodic table? It's even less stable. Okay. No. We have to talk about two types of bonds. We have to talk about homonuclear bonds, which are, of course, carbon-carbon bonds, and heteronuclear bonds. Things like carbon-nitrogen bonds, carbon-oxygen bonds, right? Esters and ethers, carbon, oxygen, phosphate. I'm not drawing all the bonds, but just to give you some idea of what I mean by heteronuclear bonds. Now, these in general are less stable than homonuclear carbon-carbon bonds. And as a result, it's easier to have reactions that utilize the heteronuclear bonds. And so these are commonly involved in biochemical reactions. Okay. Now, our decision to say that we believe in mechanism rather than vitalism, and our understanding that it's these heteronuclear bonds that are going to be targeted in biochemistry, means that the very same rules that you learned in 512 in organic chemistry are what we're going to apply when we try to understand biochemistry. But this introduces one complicated aspect.